Welcome to Chanel. The latest. The Ukrainian army went to war with around 800 active T-64 tanks. In the 11 months since Russia widened its attack on Ukraine, the Ukrainians have lost around half of the 40-ton, 3-person T-64s. And in contrast to the other major tank types in Ukrainian service, the T-72 and T-80, there aren't many outside sources for additional T-64s. Every T-64 the Ukrainian army loses as a T-64 it probably can't replace.
That helps to explain why Kyiv has been lobbying its allies hard for NATO-style tanks. As the T-64s run out, the Ukrainian army must transition to new, more sustainable tank types.
The T-64 is unique among Soviet-style tanks. In the early 1960s, the Soviet Army mostly used T-54-55s and newer T-62s. The former has a 100mm main gun. The latter, a 115mm main gun. Both types have a 4-person crew including a loader.
Aiming for a generational leap in mobility and firepower, the Kharkiv-Morozov Machine Building Design Bureau in northeastern Ukraine had been working on the T-64. The new tank replaced the smaller diameter guns on the T-54 55-60 line with a new 125mm gun.
The T-64 also included a fast but mechanically complex autoloader in place of the loader, shrinking the crew to 3. A new, 700-horsepower diesel engine and compact transmission replaced the bulkier, but less powerful, powertrains on older tank types. Any weight the designers saved with new subsystems, they set aside for thicker armor. The result was a fast, heavily armed and thickly armored tank that, on paper, at least matched contemporary Western tanks. But the T-64 was complex, hard to build and expensive, so while some of the best Soviet formations re-equipped with the Ukrainian-made T-64, the Soviet Army launched development of a cheaper alternative. The resulting T-72 had a simpler but slower autoloader and a less complex transmission. As a bonus, the T-72 is made in Russia at the Urovanzavod factory in Nizhny Tagil. From the T-64's introduction in 1963, the Soviet Union had two parallel tank lines. The T-64 evolved into the T-80. The T-72 meanwhile evolved into the T-90. But the T-64 had Ukrainian DNA and, of course, was manufactured in Ukraine by some of the Soviet Union's best engineers and skilled laborers. While the T-80 factory was in Russia, after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, the Russian army gradually standardized on the simpler, cheaper T-72 and T-90. The Ukrainian army for its part stuck with the T-64 and, to a lesser extent, a turbine-powered version of the T-80. After 5 decades, the T-64s were on the verge of obsolescence. Their guns, engines and autoloaders still worked just fine, but their optics, including a passive infrared sight that required a matching infrared spotlight, were outdated and their armor was lacking. The Russian invasion of Ukraine's Crimean Peninsula in 2014 motivated the Ukrainian Defense Ministry to revamp the T-64 fleet. The new T-64BV variant boasts modern optics, including a passive infrared sight, no spotlight, plus tightly fitting reactive armor blocks.
The T-64BV is perfectly capable of beating even the newest Russian tanks. In pitched fighting outside Chernihiv in the early weeks of the current, wider war, the Ukrainian Army's 1st Tank Brigade deployed its roughly 100 T-64BVs into the forests between Chernihiv and nearby Kyiv.
When Russian tanks rolled past, the T-64BV crews opened fire at point-blank range, counting on their faster autoloaders to give them an advantage over Russian crews. The 1st Tank Brigade ultimately won the Battle of Chernihiv. But Russia's wider war on Ukraine eats tanks at a startling rate.